Hi everyone, this is part two of our Handel lecture. If you remember, last we left off, the Elector of Hanover, George Ludwig, allowed Handel to go visit London a couple of times. Handel ended up staying, and George Ludwig ended up becoming King George I of Great Britain and Ireland. And this takes us into the final and most substantial period of Handel's life. The London period spanning from 1712 to 1759. I just want to apologize because this lecture is going to be pretty info heavy even in comparison to other lectures just because this London period is so rich. When Handel moves to London, he composes a sacred choral work called Utracte Deum and Jubilate for Queen Anne, along with another piece called As Pants the Heart, which, sounds kind of weird. As a result, he ends up getting a yearly payment from the Queen of £200, which, doesn't seem like a lot, but just consider that this is happening in 1713. During this period, Handel will also receive patronage from other major folk in the artistic scene, such as the Earl of Burlington and the Duke of Chandos. In 1714, some pretty convoluted stuff happens, which we're not going to get into, but as we've already briefly touched upon, George from Hanover ends up succeeding Queen Anne. It sounds like things might have been a bit frosty between Handel and the new king because Handel did, ditch Hanover for London. But whatever quiet hostility existed there seems to have been put to rest when Handel composed and performed water music in 1717. The king had wanted a concert to be performed on the River Thames, which is about as frivolous as a royal request can possibly get, and so Handel wrote water music for this occasion, which ended up being performed upwards of 3 times in one sitting. It's also worth noting that around this time, Handel didn't compose an opera for around 5 years, which, is pretty significant. Given that opera is sort of what this guy ended up being known for, along with oratorio. So in 1719, Handel co-founds this thing called the Royal Academy of Music, which is in no way related to the school called the Royal Academy of Music, which was founded in London in 1822. So that's a bummer. Anyways, Handel's Royal Academy was created to respond to the demand of the British aristocrats who were gluttons for opera seria. Now, opera seria is, as the name might suggest to you, serious Italian opera, serious subjects, which exists in contrast to the comic form of opera called opera buffa. Now, you don't need strict definitions for these right now, but, I just think it's a good little thing for you to have in your back pocket. The Academy meant that there was now a relatively structured way for aristocrats to commission new opera seria. There's a few operas that the RCM just wants to draw particular attention to. We have Julius Caesar in 1724, and also in 1724 we have Tamerlano. And then in 1725 we have Rodelinda. Now all of these occur basically within the span of a year, but so I understand putting these together. They're also all attached and flowing from the creation of the Royal Academy of Music. But for some reason, the RCM also makes mention of 2 others here. Alcina in 1735 and Circe in 1738. I really don't understand why the RCM mentions these in the same breath as the previous 3. From what I understand, Alcina and Circe weren't actually associated with the Royal Academy of Music, from the digging around I've done. And the dates show that they were composed, around a decade later. Anyways, at the very least, this is just more information for you to possess, which isn't a bad thing. The RCM also wants to draw your attention to some of the major singers who Handel worked with during this period, so I just want to take a second to quickly and briefly introduce you to some of them. Now here on the left we have Faustina Bordoni, who was an Italian mezzo-soprano, and then on the right we have Francesca Cuzzoni, who was a soprano who was also from Italy. These 2 were really big names, and Handel would compose parts specifically for them. They were also pretty massive rivals, and legend has it that they got into this massive fight on stage during a performance of an opera, while their very, very partisan fans were cheering it on. We also have this guy named Senesino who did a lot of work with Handel. In fact, Handel wrote parts for Senesino in each of these 3 operas that we had touched on very, very briefly earlier. Senesino was what is known as a castrato, which means that he was castrated in order to preserve his high voice. If that sounds brutal, yeah, it kind of is, and it's not even kind of, it is. And castration for the purpose of singing was actually banned as of 1903. I know we don't really go into much depth with these singers, but suffice it to say that these folks were rock stars and were treated as such. All that being said, it's interesting that now we're putting so much focus on Handel and not these celebrities of the times. In 1727, George I dies, and his son George II succeeds him. Handel is commissioned to write 4 anthems for the royal coronation. Now, what's really cool here is that one of those anthems, Zadok the Priest, has actually been played at all British coronation ceremonies since that first time in 1727. 1727 was also, personally, a very big year for Handel, since it was in that year that, after all this time in Britain, he finally became a naturalized British subject. The music scene in London started changing in 1728, though. This guy named John Gay wrote an English language ballad opera called The Beggar's Opera, and it was just wildly popular. This, for us, onlookers to history, acts as a sort of sign of the times, a signal as to when the public was kind of over Italian opera in general and looking for new forms of musical and dramatic entertainment. Given that Handel was the Italian opera composer, the guy, this change in public demand was problematic for his career. In fact, the Beggar's Opera was essentially making fun of the Italian opera genre. So not only was the public demanding change for the sake of change, but it was also actively turning against Handel's love. In 1737, Handel started having some fairly serious health issues and he went to Germany to recover. And in 1741, after having plodded on with opera despite this change in public demand for a number of years, he just gave up the genre entirely in favor of focusing on other genres, oratorios, concerti. In 1741, Handel now heads to Dublin to give charity concerts. And in 1742, The Messiah, which is, of course, an oratorio, is premiered. That's all I'm going to say about that right now, since we have a very, very lengthy repertoire study about The Messiah coming up next. Handel ends up putting a lot of focus into oratorio composition and in English. And oratorios, as we previously discussed, had a lot of similarity to opera, but without the huge price tag, since oratorios are basically just a concert without need for sets and costumes, etc. Oratorios were also, as a side note, preferred by middle-class audiences to the more extravagant opera genre. In 1753, Handel retires from performing publicly, likely because his eyesight was getting just beyond bad. Like I mentioned in the Bach lectures, a surgeon named Taylor performed cataract surgery on them both. But Taylor was a charlatan, and Bach and Handel, tragically, both ended up blind. In his final years, the unmarried Handel gave generously to charity, and he continued to compose despite his lack of sight. And in 1759, April 14th to be exact, having maintained some degree of celebrity and possessing a great deal of wealth, Handel passed away. As we wrap up, I just want to go through this sort of summation that the RCM offers as to the repertoire that Handel produced during his career. Although I want to note that this is very much not exhaustive. So if you're looking at this and going, oh, this is all he wrote, no, that's not true. If you want to look at that, places like Wikipedia are actually really good, or IMSLP if you want to see scores too. So Handel wrote a lot of orchestral work, including suites. We talked about water music. There was also music for the royal fireworks. Wrote concerto grossi, organ concertos. Wrote chamber music, light trio sonatas. We have keyboard music, organ and harpsichord repertoire. As far as vocal things are concerned, we have 40 plus operas, such as Rinaldo, Julius Caesare, Circe, Orlando. So nearly 30 oratorios, which is really interesting. Nearly 30 oratorios. Opera was Handel's thing. And it was in the back half of his life that he really started focusing on oratorios, but we have a close number here. We have things like the Messiah, Judas Maccabeus, Israel in Egypt. And we have sacred vocal work, such as Te Deum, Ode for Saint Cecilia, Coronation anthems, and over 100 cantatas. Next, we're going to start working on the Messiah, which is going to be a couple lectures because it's just a lot of music. Thank you for listening to these last two Handel biography lectures, and I'll see you in the next one.